Now we'll talk about the similarities to private sector audits. So threats to independence exists in both a public sector audit and in a private sector audit. Understanding the entity and its environment, including internal control, is essential in both types of audits. There's always a risk assessment conducted in both. The auditors design and perform further audit procedures, and they must obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence to be able to draw reasonable conclusions. Both types of audit need qualified personnel, and the auditors provide reasonable assurance, but it's not an absolute assurance. And both need to communicate deficiencies in internal control to those charged with governance. Next, we move on to the differences between public sector audits and private sector audits. So governments are held to a higher standard of accountability than private sectors. The mandates are broader in a public sector. The management responsibility may include assuring that the entity complies with regulations, laws, and other authorities, and mandates such as reporting directly to the public or the legislature. Factors such as public interest, accountability, and providing assurance of legislative oversight could play an important role in assessing whether an item is material. Some specific competencies and skills may be necessary in auditing public sectors. A comprehensive assessment of whether a public sector entity complies with regulations and other authorities. Reporting deficiencies in internal controls to the legislature or other governing parties at a more detailed level in a public sector audit, including deficiencies about compliance with laws and regulations. Auditors not only need to consider risks of material misstatement of the financial statements, but also include a broader responsibility to consider risks of fraud. In the public sector, there may be legal or regulatory limitations on the information that the current auditor can obtain from a predecessor auditor. Next, we move on to an example of an audited report of a public sector entity, and for this we chose the Canadian Institute of Health and Research, and we used the 2013 to 2014 annual report. So the report will generally start with the statement of management responsibility, including internal control over financial reporting, and then there's the independent auditor's report, which consists of management's responsibility for the financial statements, and then the auditor's responsibility, and then the auditor's opinion. And then we'll have our financial statements, and starting off with the statement of financial position. In the public sector financial statements, this constitutes the liabilities, like the financial statement. The statement of financial position starts off with liabilities, less financial assets, which equals the net debt, and then from that we subtract the non-financial assets, which give us the net financial position. So the statement of financial position is a little bit different from the private sector financial statements. Then we have the statement of operations, which is basically the income statement in a private sector financial statements. So we start off with the expenses less the revenues, and that gives us the net cost of operations before government funding. Then we add the government funding, which gives us the net cost of operations after government funding. Next, we have the statement of change in debt and net debt. So the net revenue, or the cost of operations after government funding, which is basically the operating surplus or deficit. And then we take into account the change due to tangible capital assets, whether purchases, disposition, amortization of tangible assets, and non-financial assets. Then we have our statement of cash flows. Usually the direct method is encouraged in the public sector, and then also cash flows from capital activities should be shown separately from cash flows from investing activities and cash flows from financial activities. And finally, we have the notes to the financial statement.